The morning inspection bell clanged across the Canadian Pacific Telegraph station at Cold Creek, its metallic shriek cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a blade through frozen air. Clara Whitmore straightened her shoulders beneath the heavy wool uniform, her fingers automatically smoothing the brass buttons, despite knowing that Superintendent Morrison would find fault regardless. Her left hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her collar, the familiar weakness that had plagued her since childhood now a daily reminder of her precarious position in this remote outpost. Morrison's boots struck the wooden platform with military precision, each step echoing through the sparse waiting room where 3 other operators stood at rigid attention. The superintendent's weathered face bore the permanent scowl of a man who had fought his way up from track-laying gangs to administrative power, and his gray eyes swept across his subordinates with the cold efficiency of a predator evaluating prey. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the station windows, where the first pale light of dawn painted the endless Saskatchewan prairie in shades of silver and shadow. "Operator Whitmore." Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Step forward." Clara's weak hand clenched involuntarily as she moved toward the superintendent, her boots clicking against the worn planks. The other operators remained motionless, but she could feel their eyes tracking her movement, waiting for whatever public humiliation Morrison had prepared. In the 18 months since her arrival at Cold Creek, these morning inspections had become a ritual of power, a daily reminder that her position hung by the thinnest of threads. "Your transmission logs from yesterday." Morrison held up a leather-bound ledger, its pages fluttering in the bitter wind that swept through the gaps in the station walls. "Explain the irregularities in entries 43 through 47. Clara's mind raced through the previous day's work, searching for any deviation from protocol that might have drawn Morrison's attention. The Telegraph had been unusually active, with messages flowing in from Winnipeg, Calgary, and the smaller stations that dotted the railway line like beads on a string. But nothing had seemed out of the ordinary, nothing that would warrant this public scrutiny. "Sir, I recorded all transmissions according to regulation. Each message was logged with timestamp, origin, destination, and operator codes." Her voice remained steady despite the growing knot of anxiety in her chest. Morrison opened the ledger and began reading in a voice loud enough for all present to hear. "Message 43, received at 1432 hours. Origin listed as unknown. Content, tell my mother the snow was deep, but we held the line. Signed, Private Thomas Kellerman." He looked up from the page, his gray eyes boring into Clara's face. "Care to explain how a dead man sent a telegraph message?" The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Thomas Kellerman had been killed at Vimy Ridge 2 years prior, his name inscribed on the memorial plaque that hung in the station's main office alongside dozens of other local boys who had not returned from the war. She had transcribed the message exactly as it had come through the wire, following the sacred protocol that demanded every word be recorded without interpretation or judgment. "I transcribed the message as received, sir. Protocol requires accurate recording regardless of content." "Protocol." Morrison's laugh was devoid of humor. "Protocol does not include entertaining the fantasies of grief-stricken relatives or the pranks of bored operators down the line. You will explain how this message appeared on your wire." Clara's weak hand began to tremble more noticeably, and she pressed it against her thigh to still the movement. The truth was that she had no explanation. The message had appeared on her wire just like any other, the familiar rhythm of dots and dashes spelling out words that made no sense yet demanded to be recorded. She had checked the sender codes twice, verified the routing information, and found nothing to indicate the message's true origin. "I cannot explain the source, sir, but I recorded it faithfully." Morrison slammed the ledger shut with a sound like a gunshot. "You recorded it faithfully because you lack the intelligence to recognize a hoax when it crosses your wire. This station operates under the authority of the Canadian Pacific Railway, not some spiritualist parlor where the dead speak through telegraph keys." The other operators shifted slightly, their discomfort palpable in the growing tension. Clara caught a glimpse of sympathy in the eyes of Sarah Bennett, the senior night operator, but knew that any show of support would only make her own situation worse. In this isolated outpost, survival depended on maintaining Morrison's favor, and that favor was as changeable as the prairie weather. "You will report to my office after the morning shift," Morrison continued, his voice dropping to a more dangerous quiet. "We will discuss the consequences of allowing personal imagination to interfere with professional duty, and if any similar irregularities appear in your logs, you will find yourself on the next eastbound train with a dismissal letter in your pocket." As Morrison strode away, his boots ringing against the platform, Clara remained at attention until the sound faded into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to breathe normally, her weak hands still trembling from the public humiliation. The other operators dispersed to their positions without comment, leaving her alone with the growing realization that her carefully constructed life at Cold Creek had just shifted onto dangerous ground. The morning shift passed in a blur of routine transmissions, freight schedules, passenger manifests, and administrative communications that flowed through the wire in their usual, predictable patterns. Clara's fingers moved across the telegraph key with automatic precision, her training taking over while her mind wrestled with the implications of Morrison's threat. Dismissal would mean returning to Toronto, to the suffocating expectations of her family and the limited opportunities available to a woman with a visible weakness that marked her as unsuitable for most employment. At precisely 1100 hours, as Clara was transcribing a mundane message about grain shipments, her wire began to chatter with a new transmission. She positioned her pencil above the logbook and began to record the familiar rhythm of dots and dashes, her hand moving smoothly across the page until the words took shape. "Message received from station unknown. Content. The mud was thick, but we held our position. Tell father his teachings about courage were true. Signed, Corporal James Morrison." Clara's pencil froze above the paper. James Morrison had been the superintendent's only son, killed in the same offensive that had claimed Thomas Kellerman. The boy's photograph still occupied a place of honor on Morrison's desk, and his death had transformed the superintendent from a stern but fair administrator into the bitter tyrant who now ruled Cold Creek with an iron fist. The implications crashed over Clara like an avalanche. Recording this message would mean certain dismissal, possibly worse. But protocol demanded absolute fidelity to the wire, and her training had been drilled into her with such intensity that the thought of falsifying a log entry felt like a violation of everything she had been taught to believe sacred about her profession. Her weak hand began to shake more violently as she considered her options. She could claim the message was garbled, report a equipment malfunction, or simply omit it from the log entirely. But each alternative felt like stepping onto a path that would lead inevitably to discovery and disgrace. The telegraph system maintained its own checks and balances, and sooner or later, every deviation from protocol would surface. Clara made her choice with the deliberate care of someone defusing an explosive device. She completed the log entry exactly as the message had been received, then carefully tore out the page and folded it into a small square. If Morrison demanded to see the original logs, she would claim the page had been damaged by ink spillage and provide a clean transcription of all other messages. It was a desperate gambit, but it might buy her enough time to understand what was happening on her wire. The rest of the shift crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every incoming message made her heart race. Every sound from Morrison's office sent a jolt of anxiety through her chest. When the afternoon operator arrived to relieve her, Clara gathered her personal items with the careful precision of someone who might not be returning to this position tomorrow. Morrison's office occupied the corner of the station building, its windows providing a commanding view of the railway tracks and the endless expanse of prairie beyond. Clara knocked twice and waited for permission to enter, her weak hand clutching the folded page in her coat pocket like a talisman against disaster. "Sit!" Morrison did not look up from the stack of papers on his desk, his pen scratching across an official form with mechanical regularity. Clara settled into the hard wooden chair facing his desk, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. After several minutes of silence, Morrison set down his pen and fixed her with his gray stare. Explain to me, Operator Whitmore, how a woman with your obvious limitations came to be employed at this station. The question struck at Clara's deepest insecurities, the fears that had driven her from Toronto to this remote outpost where her weaknesses might be overlooked in exchange for competent service. Sir, I was trained at the Dominion Telegraph Institute and graduated with commendation. My left-hand weakness does not affect my ability to operate equipment or maintain accurate records. Your records suggest otherwise. Morrison opened a different ledger, this one containing personnel files and evaluation reports. 47 irregular entries in the past 6 months. Messages with questionable origins, garbled transmissions that could not be verified, and now communications allegedly from dead soldiers. Clara felt the walls of the office closing in around her, the carefully constructed defense of her competence crumbling under Morrison's relentless assault. But beneath the fear, a spark of anger began to grow. She had served this station faithfully, working longer hours than any other operator, and maintaining equipment that lesser technicians would have declared beyond repair. Sir, every entry in my logs represents an accurate transcription of received transmissions. If the content appears irregular, that is not a reflection of my competence, but of conditions beyond my control. Morrison's eyes narrowed. Conditions beyond your control? Such as? Clara hesitated, knowing that her next words would either save her position or seal her fate. Atmospheric interference has been unusually heavy this winter. Solar storm activity can cause signal reflection and routing errors. It is possible that old messages are being bounced through the system, creating the appearance of new transmissions. It was a desperate improvisation, but Morrison's expression suggested that the explanation had at least given him pause. Clara pressed her advantage, drawing on every scrap of technical knowledge she had accumulated during her training. The irregularities follow a pattern consistent with electromagnetic reflection, sir. Messages appear during periods of high solar activity and always originate from unstable routing codes. I believe we may be receiving echoes of old transmissions, possibly dating back several years. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his weathered fingers drumming against the desk surface. Clara could see him weighing her explanation against his desire to find fault, the rational administrator warring with the grief-driven tyrant who saw conspiracy in every shadow. You will prepare a detailed technical report on these atmospheric irregularities, he said finally. Include frequency analysis, timing correlations, and equipment specifications. If your theory proves correct, it will be forwarded to railway headquarters for investigation. If it proves false, you will be dismissed for incompetence and possible fraud. Clara nodded, knowing that she had just committed herself to an elaborate deception that would require all her skill and intelligence to maintain. Yes, sir. When do you require the report? 1 week. And Operator Whitmore? Morrison's voice carried a note of warning that made her skin crawl. If any more messages from dead soldiers appear in your logs, atmospheric interference will be the least of your concerns. As Clara left Morrison's office, the folded page in her pocket seemed to burn against her skin like a live coal. She had bought herself time, but at the cost of a promise she was not sure she could keep. The dead were speaking through her wire, and she was the only one who could hear them. The evening shift brought no respite from her anxiety. Clara threw herself into routine maintenance tasks, calibrating equipment and cleaning contact points with obsessive precision. But as the station settled into its nighttime quiet and the other operators departed for their quarters, she found herself alone with the telegraph key and the growing certainty that more messages would come. At 2300 hours, her wire began to chatter. The message that arrived at 2300 hours carried the mechanical precision of standard railway communication, but its content made Clara's blood turn to ice water in her veins. She transcribed each word with trembling fingers, her weak hand cramping as she struggled to maintain the steady script that protocol demanded. Message received from station unknown. Content. The officers said we would be home for Christmas. Mother's letters stopped coming in November. Tell her I forgive the silence. Signed, Lieutenant William Chen. Clara stared at the page, her breath forming small clouds in the unheated station office. William Chen had been killed at Passchendaele in October of 1917. His death reported in the Cold Creek Herald, alongside the photograph of a young man whose smile held no hint of the muddy grave that awaited him. His mother still lived in town, a bent figure in black who haunted the railway platform whenever eastbound trains arrived, as if her son might step down from the passenger car with his kit bag and his stories of foreign places. The implications of recording this message crashed over Clara like winter wind through an open door. Morrison's ultimatum echoed in her memory. Any more messages from dead soldiers would mean immediate dismissal, but the alternative, falsifying official records, represented a violation of everything she had been taught about the sacred duty of telegraph operators to serve as faithful conduits for human communication. Clara made her decision with the desperate calculation of a gambler placing her last bet. She completed the log entry, then carefully removed the page and added it to the folded paper already hidden in her coat pocket. Tomorrow she would claim that equipment malfunction had damaged several log pages, requiring clean transcription of all salvageable messages. It was a thin deception, but it might hold long enough for her to understand what forces were manipulating her wire. The rest of her shift passed in nervous tension, every sound from the darkened platform making her heart race with the fear that Morrison had returned for a surprise inspection. But the station remained quiet, except for the occasional freight train that thundered past without stopping, its whistle echoing across the prairie like the cry of some enormous beast fleeing through the darkness. At 0600 hours, Sarah Bennett arrived for the morning shift, her weathered face bearing the permanent exhaustion of someone who had spent too many years listening to voices from distant places. Sarah had been operating telegraph equipment since before Clara was born, her fingers moving across the keys with the unconscious grace of a pianist performing a familiar sonata. "Rough night?" Sarah asked, noting the tension in Clara's posture. "Equipment troubles. Some interference on the main line." Clara gathered her materials with careful precision, avoiding Sarah's knowing gaze. The older woman had survived 3 superintendents and countless administrative purges, and her instincts for detecting deception had been honed by decades of navigating bureaucratic dangers. "Interference can be tricky this time of year," Sarah agreed, her tone suggesting that she understood more than her words revealed. "Solar activity. Atmospheric pressure changes. Sometimes old signals bounce around the system like echoes in an empty room." Clara felt a surge of hope at the older woman's words. If Sarah could corroborate her theory about electromagnetic interference, it might provide the scientific foundation her deception required. "Have you experienced similar problems?" "More than I care to remember. Back in '98, we had signals coming through that claimed to be from stations that had been abandoned for years. Turned out to be a combination of solar storm activity and equipment malfunction at the main relay station in Winnipeg." Sarah's eyes met Clara's with a steady gaze that conveyed both warning and support. Of course, that was before Morrison's time. He might not be familiar with such technical irregularities. The morning inspection proceeded without incident. Morrison's attention focused on new regulations from railway headquarters regarding emergency communication protocols. Clara stood at attention with the other operators, her hidden pages burning like guilty secrets against her ribs, while the superintendent read from official memoranda that established increasingly strict penalties for deviation from established procedures. "Effective immediately," Morrison announced. "All irregular transmissions must be reported within 2 hours of receipt. This includes messages with questionable origins, garbled content, or routing codes that cannot be verified through standard channels." His gray eyes swept across the assembled operators, lingering longest on Clara's face. The railway cannot afford to maintain personnel who lack the judgment to distinguish between legitimate communication and deliberate fraud. After Morrison's departure, the operators dispersed to their assigned duties with the subdued efficiency of soldiers who had survived another morning formation. Clara settled at her workstation, the familiar weight of headphones and the smooth surface of the telegraph key providing small comfort against the growing anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The morning brought a steady stream of routine messages. Supply requisitions, personnel transfers, and weather reports that painted a picture of a transportation system operating with clockwork precision across the vast Canadian landscape. Clara transcribed each transmission with mechanical accuracy, her training allowing her to maintain professional standards while her mind wrestled with the impossible problem of the messages from dead soldiers. At 1130 hours, her concentration was shattered by the arrival of Mrs. Chen. The elderly Chinese woman entered the station office with the hesitant steps of someone unaccustomed to dealing with official institutions. Her black mourning dress, worn continuously since her son's death, had faded to a deep gray that seemed to absorb light from the winter morning. She approached Clara's desk with downcast eyes, clutching a small leather purse with hands that trembled from age or emotion. "Excuse me, miss. I need to send message to Toronto, to William's commanding officer." Clara felt her throat constrict as she looked into the woman's face, seeing there the patient suffering of someone who had never quite accepted that her child would not return from war. Mrs. Chen's monthly messages to military authorities, inquiring about additional details of her son's service, had become a familiar ritual that usually required assistance with the complex forms and procedures. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. Please have a seat, and I'll prepare the necessary paperwork." As Clara gathered the telegraph forms, her guilty conscience transformed Mrs. Chen's presence from routine customer service into a moral trial that threatened to expose her deception. The message, hidden in her pocket, seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy, a communication from the woman's dead son that could provide the comfort she desperately sought, or shatter her carefully maintained hopes with news too painful to bear. Mrs. Chen dictated her message with the formal precision of someone who had learned English as a second language and never quite trusted her ability to navigate its complexities. To Colonel Henderson, 1st Canadian Division. Request information regarding personal effects of Lieutenant William Chen, service number 4729. Family requires closure for spiritual purposes. Clara transcribed the words onto the official form, her professional demeanor masking the internal turmoil that made her hands shake with suppressed emotion. She had the power to give this grieving mother a message from her son, but exercising that power would mean revealing her deception to Morrison and facing the consequences that would surely follow. "Will there be a reply, miss?" Mrs. Chen asked as Clara calculated the transmission charges. "Military communications often take several days to process," Clara replied, the standard explanation feeling like ash in her mouth. "We'll notify you as soon as any response arrives." After Mrs. Chen's departure, Clara stared at the telegraph key with growing resentment toward the impossible position in which she found herself trapped. The dead were speaking through her wire, carrying messages of love and forgiveness that could ease the suffering of the living, but the living world's rigid protocols demanded that such communications be suppressed in the name of administrative efficiency. The afternoon shift brought another test of her resolve when Thomas Kellerman's father arrived at the station. The old farmer's weathered face bore the permanent lines of someone who had spent decades wresting sustenance from unforgiving soil, and his presence filled the small office with the earthy smell of livestock and honest labor. "Need to send word to my brother in Saskatoon," he announced in the blunt manner of someone unaccustomed to urban courtesies. "Wife's been poorly since Thomas passed. Doctor says she needs to be near family for a while." Clara nodded and prepared another set of forms, her conscience now burning with the knowledge that she possessed a message from his son that might provide the comfort his wife desperately needed. But revealing that message would mean destroying her own carefully constructed life at Cold Creek, trading temporary solace for lasting disgrace. As evening approached and the other operators prepared to depart for their quarters, Clara found herself alone with the weight of accumulated secrets that threatened to crush her beneath their moral burden. She had positioned herself as the guardian of communications from the dead, but the responsibility was proving more complex and painful than she had imagined. At 2200 hours, as Clara was preparing to close the station for the night, her wire began to chatter with another transmission. She positioned her pencil above a fresh log page, her trained reflexes taking over even as her rational mind recoiled from what was about to unfold. Message received from station unknown. Content? The chaplain said God watches over us all, but I think God was looking the other way when the shells fell. Tell my sister that heaven is not what we expected. Signed, Private Michael O'Brien. Clara recognized the name immediately. Michael O'Brien had been Sarah Bennett's nephew, killed at Vimy Ridge alongside Thomas Kellerman and dozens of other local boys whose deaths had transformed Cold Creek from a thriving railway town into a community haunted by loss. Sarah had never spoken of her nephew's death, but Clara had noticed the small photograph that occupied a corner of the older woman's workstation, a young man in uniform whose smile seemed to mock the sorrow that surrounded his memory. This message represented a new level of moral complexity that made Clara's previous dilemmas seem simple by comparison. Sarah had shown her kindness and support, providing both technical cover for her deception and emotional comfort during Morrison's public humiliation. Keeping this message secret felt like a betrayal of that friendship, but revealing it would mean exposing her entire deception and facing the consequences that Morrison had promised. Clara made her choice with the grim determination of someone crossing a bridge that was burning behind her. She recorded the message in her official log, then immediately tore out the page and added it to her growing collection of hidden communications. Tomorrow she would claim that a coffee spill had damaged several entries, requiring clean transcription of all salvageable material. But as she prepared to leave the station, Clara realized that her deception had evolved beyond simple record falsification into something approaching active fraud. She was no longer just hiding irregular messages, but actively manipulating official documentation to maintain her position. The moral ground beneath her feet was shifting like quicksand, and each new lie required additional deceptions to support its weight. The walk to her quarters through the frigid prairie night provided no relief from the anxiety that had become her constant companion. The boarding house where railway employees lived stood like a lonely island of light in the vast darkness, its windows glowing with the warm yellow illumination of kerosene lamps. But even the promise of warmth and solitude could not quiet the voices of the dead that echoed in Clara's memory, their words carrying messages of love and loss that the living world seemed determined to suppress. In her small room on the second floor, Clara spread the hidden pages across her narrow bed and read each message again by lamplight. The words seemed to pulse with their own mysterious energy, communications from beyond the grave that demanded attention but defied explanation. Tomorrow she would face Morrison's scrutiny with a fabricated technical report that might preserve her position for another day. But she knew that the forces manipulating her telegraph wire would not remain silent forever. As she prepared for bed, Clara caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The face that looked back at her belonged to a stranger, a woman whose eyes held secrets too dangerous to share and whose weak hand trembled not just from physical infirmity, but from the weight of moral choices that grew heavier with each passing hour. Outside her window, the prairie wind carried the distant sound of a freight train heading east toward cities where the dead stayed buried, and telegraph wires carried only messages from the living. But Clara knew that she could never return to that simpler world, not now that she had heard the voices of the dead calling through the darkness with words too important to ignore. The technical report that Clara submitted to Morrison's office represented 3 sleepless nights of desperate research and careful fabrication. She had consulted every manual in the station library, interviewed maintenance workers about equipment irregularities, and constructed an elaborate theory about electromagnetic interference that wove together just enough scientific truth to support her increasingly fragile deception. The document filled 12 pages with detailed analysis of solar storm cycles, atmospheric pressure variations, and the theoretical possibility that old telegraph messages could bounce through the system like echoes in a canyon. Morrison studied the report with the methodical attention of a prosecutor examining evidence for holes, his gray eyes scanning each page while Clara stood at attention before his desk. The morning sunlight streaming through the office windows illuminated dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, and Clara found herself wondering if the dead might be present even now, watching to see whether their messages would be acknowledged or buried beneath administrative bureaucracy. "Your theory is interesting, Operator Whitmore," Morrison said finally, setting the report aside with deliberate care. "But theories require verification. You will conduct a comprehensive equipment inspection, documenting every component that might contribute to signal reflection. If atmospheric interference is truly responsible for these irregularities, the evidence will be found in the hardware." Clara's heart sank as she realized that Morrison was not accepting her explanation, but rather setting a trap that would expose her deception when no equipment malfunction could be discovered. "Yes, sir. How long do I have to complete the inspection?" 48 hours. And Operator Whitmore?" Morrison's voice carried the quiet menace of a predator toying with cornered prey. "Railway headquarters has expressed interest in your atmospheric theory. If it proves accurate, you may find yourself transferred to a position more suited to your apparent expertise in electromagnetic phenomena. If it proves false, your employment with the Canadian Pacific Railway will be terminated immediately." As Clara left Morrison's office, the weight of her deception pressed down upon her like a physical burden. She had gambled everything on a fabricated scientific theory, and now the inevitable exposure of that lie would mean not just dismissal, but professional disgrace that would follow her for the rest of her life. The voices of the dead had trapped her in a web of moral complexity that grew more tangled with each passing day. The morning shift brought a steady stream of routine communications, but Clara's attention was fractured by the knowledge that her time at Cold Creek was measured in hours rather than days. She mechanically transcribed freight schedules and administrative messages while her mind raced through possible escape routes, each more desperate than the last. She could claim sudden illness and flee eastbound before the equipment inspection exposed her lies, but such cowardice would leave the voices of the dead unheard and the grieving families without the comfort their messages might provide. At 1300 hours, Sarah Bennett approached Clara's workstation with a cup of coffee and the careful expression of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news. The older woman's weathered features bore traces of sleepless nights, and her usual professional composure seemed strained by some internal struggle. "Morrison's got you running scared," Sarah observed, settling into the chair beside Clara's desk. "Equipment inspection for atmospheric interference. Sounds like he's looking for an excuse to clean house. The irregularities in my logs have raised questions about technical competence," Clara replied, maintaining the official explanation while searching Sarah's face for signs of suspicion or support. Sarah sipped her coffee thoughtfully, her eyes focused on the telegraph equipment with the assessing gaze of someone who had spent decades coaxing reliable service from temperamental machinery. Funny thing about irregularities. Sometimes they're not irregular at all, just patterns we don't understand yet. The words carried an undertone that made Clara's pulse quicken with hope and fear. "What do you mean?" "Been working these wires for 23 years. Seen things that would make Morrison's hair stand on end, if he had the sense to pay attention." Sarah's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that barely carried above the ambient noise of the station. "Messages that come through during the deep watches, when most folks are sleeping and the electromagnetic field settles into strange patterns. Messages from places that don't exist anymore, from people who've been gone so long their names are carved on stone." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized that Sarah might know about the messages from dead soldiers. "Have you ever reported such irregularities to supervisory personnel?" "Once. Back in 1999, when Superintendent Walsh was running the station. Thought he should know about the unusual signal patterns I'd been documenting." Sarah's laugh was bitter with remembered pain. "Walsh called me into his office, just like Morrison called you. Questioned my competence, threatened my position, demanded technical explanations I couldn't provide. What happened? I learned to keep my mouth shut and my logs clean. Some truths are too dangerous for official recognition, especially when they threaten the comfortable assumptions that keep men like Morrison in power." Sarah finished her coffee and stood to leave, but paused beside Clara's chair with a final whispered warning. "Be careful what you choose to record, and more careful what you choose to hide. The dead have long memories, and they don't forgive those who silence their voices." As Sarah returned to her own workstation, Clara struggled to process the implications of their conversation. If the older woman knew about the messages from dead soldiers, she might be willing to provide support for Clara's deception, but she might also represent a threat if Morrison questioned other operators about unusual transmissions. The web of secrecy surrounding the mysterious messages was larger and more complex than Clara had imagined. The afternoon brought a development that shattered Clara's remaining composure when Mrs. O'Brien arrived at the station in the company of Father McKenna, the elderly priest who served Cold Creek's small Catholic community. The woman's red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands spoke of grief too fresh to bear, while the priest's grave expression suggested that he was struggling with questions that his theological training had not prepared him to answer. "Miss Whitmore," Father McKenna began, his Irish accent thick with emotion, "Mrs. O'Brien has come to me with a most unusual request. She claims to have received a message from her deceased son through dreams, and she wishes to send a reply through official channels." Clara's blood turned to ice as she realized that the message she had hidden from Sarah might somehow be connected to this desperate mother's supernatural experiences. "I'm afraid telegraph service is limited to communication between living persons, Father. We cannot facilitate correspondence with the deceased." "Of course not," the priest agreed, his tone suggesting internal conflict between rational skepticism and pastoral compassion. "But Mrs. O'Brien is convinced that her son is trying to communicate with his sister in Vancouver, and she fears that his soul cannot find peace until the message is delivered." Mrs. O'Brien clutched the priest's arm with desperate intensity, her voice breaking as she spoke. "He came to me in dreams, miss. Clear as daylight. Said heaven isn't what the church taught him to expect. Said he needs Margaret to know the truth about what happened over there." She fumbled in her purse and produced a crumpled piece of paper covered with shaky handwriting. "I wrote down every word, just like he told me. Please, miss, I know it sounds mad, but I can feel him nearby waiting for someone to listen." Clara stared at the paper in Mrs. O'Brien's hands, knowing that it might contain words that matched the hidden message burning in her coat pocket. The temptation to reveal what she knew was almost overwhelming, but doing so would mean exposing her entire deception and facing the consequences that Morrison had promised. "Telegraph regulations require proper sender identification and payment of standard rates," Clara replied, her professional training providing refuge from the moral complexity of the situation. "I cannot process a message allegedly from a deceased person." Mrs. O'Brien's face crumpled with disappointment and renewed grief, her last desperate hope for connection with her son crushed by bureaucratic indifference. Father McKenna guided her toward the door with gentle firmness, his own expression reflecting the frustration of someone who had spent decades trying to reconcile human suffering with divine purpose. "I understand the regulations, Miss Whitmore," the priest said over his shoulder as they departed. "But sometimes the rules we follow serve neither truth nor compassion. I pray that you never find yourself in a position where duty conflicts with mercy." As the door closed behind them, Clara buried her face in her hands and fought back tears of guilt and frustration. She possessed the very message that Mrs. O'Brien desperately sought, the words of comfort and explanation that might ease the woman's suffering, but revealing them would mean destroying her own carefully constructed life at Cold Creek. The voices of the dead had trapped her in an impossible choice between personal survival and moral responsibility. The remainder of her shift passed in a haze of anxiety and self-recrimination. Clara mechanically processed routine transmissions while her conscience waged war with her survival instincts, neither side able to claim decisive victory. When evening arrived, and the other operators departed for their quarters, she found herself alone with the telegraph equipment and the growing certainty that the forces manipulating her wire would not remain silent much longer. At 2100 hours, as Clara was preparing her fabricated equipment inspection report, her wire began to chatter with a transmission that would change everything. She positioned her pencil above a fresh log page, her trained reflexes taking over even as her rational mind recoiled from what was about to unfold. Message from Station Identification, Quebec 77. Content: This is Deputy Marshal Thomas Hendricks, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We have intercepted unauthorized communications originating from your station. Prepare for immediate inspection and seizure of all telegraph equipment and records. Clara's pencil froze above the page as the implications crashed over her like an avalanche. Quebec. 77 was the identification code for the RCMP detachment at Regina, and Deputy Marshal Hendricks was a real person whose reputation for relentless investigation had become legendary throughout the Prairie provinces. But the message made no sense. Unauthorized communications required a complainant and formal legal process before police intervention, and her deception involved record falsification rather than illegal transmission. Unless someone had discovered the messages from dead soldiers and reported them to authorities as evidence of fraud or sedition. Clara completed the log entry with trembling hands, then immediately tore out the page and added it to her growing collection of hidden documents. But this time, the familiar gesture felt less like protection than preparation for flight. If the RCMP was truly coming to inspect her records, they would discover the gaps in her logs and demand explanations she could not provide without revealing the supernatural communications that had started her down this path of deception. As she gathered her personal belongings and prepared to leave the station, Clara realized that her time for passive concealment had ended. The forces that had been speaking through her wire were preparing for some kind of confrontation, and she would need to choose sides in a conflict between the living and the dead that she barely understood. The walk to her quarters through the bitter prairie night felt like a march toward execution. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or destruction, and Clara knew that her carefully constructed life at Cold Creek was balanced on the edge of a precipice that grew more unstable with each passing hour. The voices of the dead had given her a terrible gift, and now she would learn whether that gift was salvation or damnation. Clara did not sleep that night. She sat by her window watching the darkness for signs of approaching lawmen. The hidden messages spread across her bed like evidence in a trial where she served as both defendant and jury. The words of the dead seemed to glow in the lamplight, each communication carrying the weight of love and loss that the living world had deemed too dangerous for official acknowledgement. By dawn, she had made her decision with the cold clarity that comes only in moments when all illusions have been stripped away. The morning inspection bell found Clara already dressed and waiting on the station platform, her personal belongings packed in a single carpet bag and the hidden messages secured in an envelope addressed to Father McKenna. If the RCMP was coming for her records, she would ensure that the voices of the dead reached their intended recipients before official silence could bury them forever. Morrison's boots rang against the wooden planks with their usual military precision, but this morning his weathered face bore an expression of satisfaction that made Clara's skin crawl with foreboding. "Operator Whitmore, step forward for special assignment." Clara moved toward the superintendent with the steady pace of someone walking to her own execution. The other operators remained at attention, but she could feel their eyes tracking her movement with the morbid fascination that accompanies public disgrace. Morrison held a telegram form in his hands, its official letterhead visible even at distance. This communication arrived at 0500 hours from the Regional Administrative Office in Winnipeg. "You are hereby reassigned to special duties pending completion of your equipment inspection report." Morrison's gray eyes glittered with malicious pleasure as he continued reading. "Effective immediately. You will surrender all station keys, logbooks, and official materials to your replacement operator. You will continue to receive basic accommodation pending final disposition of your employment status." The words hit Clara like physical blows, each phrase stripping away another layer of the life she had built at Cold Creek. Reassignment to special duties was administrative code for suspension without pay, a bureaucratic limbo that preceded formal dismissal. Morrison was removing her from active duty before the RCMP inspection could expose her deception, ensuring that any scandal would be contained and attributed to individual incompetence rather than systemic failure. "Sir, I request the opportunity to complete my equipment inspection as previously assigned." Morrison's laugh was devoid of humor. "Your inspection privileges have been revoked, pending investigation of irregularities in your maintenance reports. Operator Jensen will assume responsibility for technical assessments." He gestured toward a thin young man whose nervous expression suggested that he had been recruited specifically to rubber stamp whatever conclusions Morrison desired. As Clara surrendered her station keys and official materials, she caught Sarah Bennett's eye across the platform. The older woman's face bore an expression of sympathetic understanding that spoke of similar experiences with administrative persecution. Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly toward the envelope in Clara's hand, a gesture that might have meant encouragement or warning or simple acknowledgement of shared secrets too dangerous for public discussion. Clara spent the morning in her quarters, listening to the familiar sounds of station operations through her window while preparing for whatever confrontation awaited her. At precisely noon, as she had expected, heavy boots rang against the boarding house stairs and a firm knock echoed through her door. She opened it to find Deputy Marshal Thomas Hendricks standing in the hallway, his imposing figure filling the doorframe with an authority that made Morrison's petty tyranny seem insignificant by comparison. Hendricks was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with the weathered features of someone who had spent years tracking criminals across the vast Canadian wilderness. His uniform bore the red serge and brass buttons that commanded respect throughout the frontier territories, and his steady brown eyes held the patient intelligence of a man who had learned to read human nature through its deceptions and self-betrayals. "Miss Whitmore, I am Deputy Marshal Hendricks of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I need to speak with you regarding certain irregularities in telegraph communications originating from this station." Clara stepped aside to admit him, her heart racing with the knowledge that the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. Hendricks entered her small room and positioned himself near the window, his trained gaze taking inventory of her belongings with professional thoroughness. He noticed the packed carpet bag, the envelope addressed to Father McKenna, and the subtle signs of someone preparing for hasty departure. "Planning to travel, Miss Whitmore? I have been reassigned to special duties pending completion of administrative review. I thought it prudent to prepare for possible relocation." Clara settled into the room's single chair, leaving Hendricks to stand in a position that emphasized his physical and legal authority. "Your superintendent has reported unusual activities in your telegraph logs. Messages with questionable origins, content that suggests possible fraud or seditious communication." Hendricks produced a notebook and pencil, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "I need you to explain the source of these irregular transmissions." Clara realized that Morrison had contacted the RCMP not in response to the warning message she had received, but as part of a deliberate campaign to destroy her career before she could expose whatever larger conspiracy surrounded the messages from dead soldiers. The superintendent was using law enforcement as a weapon against her, transforming her moral struggle into a criminal investigation that would discredit her permanently. "Deputy Marshal, the irregularities in my logs represent accurate transcription of received communications. If the content appears unusual, that is not evidence of fraud, but of atmospheric conditions beyond my control." Hendricks made notes in his book, his expression giving no hint of whether he found her explanation credible or ridiculous. "Atmospheric conditions that cause dead soldiers to send messages to their families. That's a remarkable meteorological phenomenon, Miss Whitmore." The words carried enough sarcasm to make Clara's cheeks burn with embarrassment, but beneath the official skepticism she detected something else. A watchful intelligence that suggested Hendricks might be more interested in truth than convenient conclusions. She made her own gamble with the desperate calculation of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Deputy Marshal, have you ever investigated cases involving supernatural communications? Messages from deceased persons that cannot be explained through conventional means?" Hendricks stopped writing and looked up from his notebook, his brown eyes studying Clara's face with renewed attention. "Why do you ask?" "Because the messages in my logs were not fabricated for fraudulent purposes. They were transcribed exactly as received from sources I cannot identify or explain." Clara reached for the envelope addressed to Father McKenna, her weak hand trembling as she made the decision that would either save or damn her. "If you are truly interested in understanding these irregularities, you should examine the communications I was ordered to suppress." She handed Hendricks the envelope containing the hidden messages, watching his expression change as he realized the significance of what she was offering. The deputy marshal opened the envelope and examined the pages with the careful attention of someone trained to evaluate evidence, his eyes moving across the handwritten transcriptions while his face remained professionally neutral. These messages were received through your telegraph equipment, but not recorded in official logs, he asked after several minutes of silence. They were recorded initially, then removed on orders from Superintendent Morrison. He claimed that communications allegedly from deceased persons represented fraud or incompetence that could not be tolerated in official records. Hendricks folded the messages and returned them to the envelope, but Clara noticed that he did not give them back to her. Miss Whitmore, what do you believe is the source of these transmissions? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a pistol shot. Clara realized that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of every grieving family in Cold Creek who might find comfort in messages from their lost sons and brothers. She chose her words with the precision of someone diffusing an explosive device. I believe that human consciousness may persist after physical death in ways that our current understanding cannot explain. I believe that strong emotional connections between the living and the dead may create conditions that allow communication across the boundary between life and death. And I believe that dismissing such communications as fraud or delusion does a disservice to both the dead who seek to speak and the living who desperately need to hear their voices. Hendricks studied her face for a long moment, his expression revealing nothing of his internal thoughts. Then he returned his notebook to his pocket and moved toward the door with the decisive movements of someone who had reached an important conclusion. Miss Whitmore, you will remain available for further questioning as this investigation proceeds. Do not leave Cold Creek without official permission. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. And Miss Whitmore, the next time you receive one of these unusual communications, you will notify me immediately, rather than concealing it from official scrutiny. After Hendricks departed, Clara sat in stunned silence as she tried to process the implications of their conversation. The deputy marshal had neither arrested her nor dismissed her claims as delusion, but had instead given her instructions that suggested the investigation would continue. More importantly, he had kept the hidden messages, treating them as evidence rather than fantasy. The afternoon brought a visit from Sarah Bennett, who arrived at Clara's door with a pot of tea and the cautious expression of someone venturing into dangerous territory. The older woman settled into the room's second chair with the familiar movements of someone who had navigated many such crises during her long career. Heard you had a visit from the law, Sarah began, pouring tea with steady hands, despite the tension that surrounded them both. Morrison's been strutting around the station like a rooster in a henhouse, telling anyone who'll listen about his successful campaign to clean up irregular operations. Deputy Marshal Hendricks was professional and thorough. I answered his questions honestly and provided what assistance I could with his investigation. Sarah sipped her tea thoughtfully, her weathered features reflecting decades of accumulated wisdom about the complexities of institutional politics. Honesty's a dangerous commodity in a place like this. Sometimes the truth serves justice, and sometimes it just gives your enemies better ammunition. Sarah, how long have you known about the messages from dead soldiers? The older woman's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with more force than necessary. Long enough to understand that some secrets are too dangerous for casual conversation. Long enough to know that certain truths can destroy the people who speak them, even when those truths might comfort the living and honor the dead. Clara leaned forward in her chair, sensing that Sarah might finally be willing to share the knowledge she had guarded for so many years. Have you received such messages yourself? My nephew, Michael, 2 nights after you started hiding pages from your logs, came through on the night wire when I was alone at the station. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper thick with suppressed emotion. Said he was sorry for the things he had to do during the war. Said heaven wasn't punishment or reward, just a place where truth couldn't be hidden anymore. The admission hung between them like a bridge across a dangerous chasm. Clara realized that she was not alone in her struggle with the voices of the dead, that the supernatural communications represented a phenomenon affecting multiple operators who had learned to hide their experiences from official scrutiny. Why didn't you tell me? Because telling would have made you an accomplice in my deception rather than just a victim of your own. Because some burdens are too heavy to share, even when sharing might make them easier to bear. Sarah finished her tea and stood to leave, but paused beside Clara's chair with a final warning. Be careful what you choose to trust Deputy Marshal Hendricks with. Law enforcement serves order, not truth, and sometimes those two things are enemies rather than allies. That evening, as Clara prepared for another sleepless night, her door was opened by an unexpected visitor. Father McKenna stood in the hallway, the envelope she had prepared for him clutched in his weathered hands. The priest's expression bore the complex mixture of wonder and fear that accompanies encounters with mysteries that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. "Miss Whitmore, I must speak with you about the contents of this envelope. The messages you have transcribed. They contain information that no living person could possess." Clara admitted the priest and listened as he explained how the communications matched details from confessions he had heard from dying soldiers, secrets that the dead had carried with them to their graves and that their families had never known. The messages represented not just evidence of survival after death, but proof that the boundary between the living and the dead was more permeable than theology had taught him to believe. "What do you want me to do with this knowledge, Father?" The priest clutched the envelope with trembling hands, his faith struggling to accommodate truths that his training had never prepared him to accept. "I want you to help me understand what God intends us to learn from these communications. And I want you to help me decide whether the comfort they might bring to grieving families is worth the chaos they would certainly create in a world that is not ready to accept such revelations." As Father McKenna departed into the prairie darkness, Clara realized that the forces she had unleashed by recording the voices of the dead were spreading beyond her ability to control or contain them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new moral choices, but tonight she would rest in the knowledge that she was no longer alone in her struggle with truths too dangerous for easy acceptance. The summons came at dawn with the harsh clang of the emergency bell, its urgent rhythm cutting through the morning stillness like a cry of alarm across the frozen prairie. Clara dressed quickly and hurried to the station, where she found the platform crowded with townspeople whose faces bore the tense expressions of a community confronting crisis. Deputy Marshal Hendricks stood beside Morrison's office door, his red serge uniform stark against the weathered wood, while inside the building voices rose in heated argument that carried clearly through the thin walls. "The situation has escalated beyond local administrative control," Hendricks announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to maintaining order in chaotic circumstances. "As of this morning, this telegraph station is under federal investigation for irregularities that may constitute fraud against the Canadian Pacific Railway and seditious communication with foreign agents." Clara felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that Morrison had escalated his campaign of persecution to include charges of treason. The superintendent was not content with simple dismissal but was seeking to destroy her completely, using the mysterious messages as evidence of criminal conspiracy rather than supernatural phenomenon. The faces around her reflected a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Neighbors who had known her for 18 months now viewing her as a potential threat to their isolated community. Morrison emerged from his office, accompanied by two men Clara did not recognize, their expensive suits and official bearing marking them as representatives from railway headquarters in Montreal. The taller man carried a leather briefcase filled with legal documents, while his companion clutched a thick file that Clara suspected contained detailed reports of her alleged misconduct. Morrison's face bore the triumphant expression of someone who had successfully orchestrated the destruction of an enemy. "Ladies and gentlemen," the tall man began, his Eastern accent sounding foreign and pretentious in the prairie morning, "I am Regional Inspector Davies from Canadian Pacific Administration. We have received reports of irregular communications originating from this station, including messages that appear to be coded correspondence with unauthorized parties. As of this moment, all telegraph operations are suspended pending completion of our investigation." The announcement struck the assembled townspeople like a physical blow. Cold Creek depended on telegraph communication for everything from supply orders to emergency medical consultation, and cutting that lifeline would isolate the community from the outside world, just as winter was tightening its grip on the prairie. Clara watched the faces around her transform from curiosity to anger as people began to understand the implications of official intervention. "Inspector Davies." Father McKenna stepped forward from the crowd, his clerical collar providing moral authority that balanced the legal power of the railway officials. This community has relied on Miss Whitmore's professional service for over a year. Whatever irregularities you believe you have discovered, surely they do not justify punishing an entire town for the alleged misconduct of one individual. Davies consulted his file with the bureaucratic precision of someone who had learned to hide behind procedure when confronted with human complexity. The irregularities in question include communications allegedly from deceased military personnel, messages with unverifiable origin codes, and systematic falsification of official logs to conceal these activities. Such behavior suggests either gross incompetence or deliberate fraud, either of which constitutes grounds for immediate suspension of service. Mrs. Chen pushed through the crowd, her small figure dignified despite the worn mourning dress that marked her as one of the war's countless victims. "Mr. Inspector," she began, her accented English carrying the weight of accumulated grief, "if messages come from my son William, why you call this fraud? Why you punish town for mother's hope to hear from dead boy?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire, its simple logic exposing the cruel absurdity of treating supernatural communication as criminal conspiracy. Davies shifted uncomfortably, his bureaucratic training inadequate for addressing the raw emotion that Mrs. Chen's words had unleashed. Clara realized that this moment represented her last opportunity to speak for the dead, to give voice to truths that official silence sought to bury. "Inspector Davies." Clara stepped forward, her weak hand trembling but her voice steady with the conviction of someone who had finally chosen her side in the conflict between the living and the dead. "The messages you describe as irregular were transcribed exactly as received through authorized telegraph equipment. If their content appears unusual, that is not evidence of fraud, but of phenomena beyond our current understanding. Miss Whitmore," Morrison's voice cut through her explanation like a blade through paper, "you are not authorized to speak during this official investigation. Return to your quarters immediately." "No." The word escaped Clara's lips before her rational mind could stop it, carrying with it the weight of 18 months of suppressed anger and moral compromise. "I will not return to my quarters while you destroy the reputation of this community to cover up your own failure to understand forces beyond your limited comprehension." The crowd stirred with the electric tension that precedes violent confrontation, townspeople sensing that they were witnessing a moment when ordinary rules no longer applied. Hendricks moved closer to Clara, his hand resting casually on his service revolver, while Morrison's face darkened with rage at this public challenge to his authority. "Miss Whitmore," Inspector Davies consulted his legal documents with increasing desperation, "you are hereby placed under formal arrest for fraud against the Canadian Pacific Railway, falsification of official documents, and seditious communication with unauthorized parties. Deputy Marshal Hendricks will escort you to Regina for prosecution under federal statutes." But Hendricks did not move to arrest her. Instead, the deputy marshal studied Clara's face with the calculating attention of someone weighing evidence that did not fit established patterns. "Inspector Davies, before we proceed with arrest procedures, I believe Miss Whitmore should be given the opportunity to demonstrate the equipment. Irregularities, she claims, are responsible for these unusual transmissions." Clara felt a surge of desperate hope as she realized that Hendricks was providing her with one final chance to prove her claims. If she could somehow cause the voices of the dead to speak publicly, in front of witnesses who could not dismiss their testimony as individual delusion, she might yet transform official persecution into recognition of truths that the living world desperately needed to acknowledge. "The equipment is under administrative seal," Morrison protested, his voice rising with the panic of someone who sensed his carefully orchestrated plan beginning to unravel. "No unauthorized personnel will be permitted access to sensitive machinery." "I am federal law enforcement investigating potential criminal activity," Hendricks replied with quiet authority that made Morrison's local tyranny seem insignificant by comparison. "I will determine what access is necessary for proper investigation. Miss Whitmore, you will demonstrate these atmospheric irregularities using standard telegraph equipment under official supervision." The crowd followed them into the station office, cramming into the small space with the eager anticipation of people who sensed they were about to witness something unprecedented. Clara approached her former workstation with trembling hands, the familiar telegraph key cold beneath her fingers as she prepared to stake everything on forces she could not control or predict. If the dead remained silent, she would face prison as a fraud and charlatan. If they spoke, she might change the world's understanding of life and death forever. She began with standard test patterns, transmitting the routine signals that verified equipment function and line connectivity. The telegraph responded normally, its mechanical rhythms providing no hint of supernatural influence. Inspector Davies consulted his pocket watch with the impatient manner of someone eager to conclude an unpleasant duty, while Morrison's face bore the satisfied expression of a predator closing in for the kill. At precisely 1100 hours, as Clara was preparing to admit defeat, her telegraph key began to move beneath her fingers with a life of its own. The crowd pressed closer as the familiar dots and dashes spelled out words that made the morning air thick with supernatural presence. Message from unknown origin. Content: tell the inspector that his brother Robert sends greetings from Vimy Ridge. The mud was thick, but we held the line for Canada and for the future you are trying to build. Do not let fear of mystery destroy the comfort that truth might bring to those who mourn. Signed, Captain Robert Davies, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Inspector Davies staggered backward as if struck by a physical blow, his bureaucratic composure shattering like glass against the impossibility of what he had just witnessed. The crowd murmured with the electric tension of people confronting forces that challenged every assumption they had made about the nature of reality. Clara looked up from the telegraph key to meet Hendrik's steady gaze, seeing there a mixture of wonder and fear that reflected her own emotional state. "Inspector Davies," Clara said quietly, "Captain Robert Davies was your brother, was he not? Killed at Vimy Ridge in April of 1917 while serving with Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry?" Davies nodded wordlessly, his throat working as he struggled to process the implications of receiving a message from a brother whose death had shaped his entire adult life. The legal documents in his briefcase suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibility that love might transcend even death itself, that the boundary between the living and the dead might be more permeable than anyone had dared to hope. "How?" Davies whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd's anxious murmuring. "How is this possible?" Before Clara could answer, the telegraph key began moving again, spelling out another message that would transform the gathering from official investigation into something approaching religious revelation. Message from unknown origin. Content: this is Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Morrison, 1st Canadian Division. Tell my son Thomas that pride and grief have made him forget the lessons I tried to teach about mercy and understanding. The dead forgive those who doubt, but they cannot forgive those who silence voices that speak only of love. Signed, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Morrison. Morrison's face went white as the message identified him as the son of a decorated officer whose death had been reported in the Cold Creek Herald 3 years earlier. Clara realized that the superintendent's brutal enforcement of regulations stemmed not from administrative zeal but from grief and guilt that had poisoned his judgment and transformed him into an enemy of the very comfort his father's memory might have provided. The crowd stirred with the complex emotions of people who had witnessed impossible things, their faces reflecting wonder and fear in equal measure. Some wept openly as they began to understand that their lost sons and husbands might not be gone forever, while others recoiled from implications that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which they had built their understanding of existence. "This is a trick," Morrison said desperately, his voice cracking with strain as he fought to maintain the rational worldview that had sustained him since his father's death. "Electromagnetic interference, equipment malfunction, deliberate manipulation by someone with access to military records." But his protests sounded hollow even to his own ears. Overwhelmed by the evidence of his own senses and the testimony of witnesses whose integrity could not be questioned. Father McKenna stepped forward from the crowd, his clerical authority providing a bridge between supernatural revelation and religious understanding. "My friends," the priest began, his Irish accent thick with emotion, "we have witnessed something that challenges our understanding but need not destroy our faith. If the dead can speak to the living, if love transcends even death itself, then perhaps we have been given a glimpse of divine mystery that calls us to greater compassion rather than greater fear. The crowd began to disperse slowly, townspeople departing in small groups to discuss and process what they had experienced. Clara remained at the telegraph station, her hands still resting on the key that had become a conduit between worlds. Inspector Davies approached her with the humble manner of someone whose certainties had been shattered by truths too large for bureaucratic comprehension. "Miss Whitmore," he began, his Eastern accent now sounding uncertain rather than authoritative, "I must ask you to continue monitoring these communications under official supervision. If the dead are truly speaking through telegraph wires, then we need to understand the implications for both the living and the administration of our communications systems." As the morning dissolved into afternoon, Clara found herself at the center of a transformation that extended far beyond her personal struggle with supernatural forces. The voices of the dead had finally been heard by the living world, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The commission that arrived from Ottawa 3 weeks later carried the authority of the federal government and the bewildered expressions of men confronting phenomena that existing bureaucracy had never anticipated. Clara watched from her reinstated position at the telegraph station as black automobiles disgorged officials whose expensive overcoats and leather briefcases marked them as representatives of a world far removed from the harsh realities of prairie life. The lead commissioner, a silver-haired man named Sir William Mackenzie, had served as Deputy Minister of Communications for 15 years, but nothing in his administrative experience had prepared him for investigating conversations with the dead. The hearing convened in the Cold Creek schoolhouse, its single room packed with townspeople whose lives had been transformed by 3 weeks of regular communication with deceased relatives. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, clutching transcripts of 17 messages from her son William, each one providing details of his military service that she had never known and comfort that no living person could have offered. Beside her, Mrs. O'Brien held similar documents from her son Michael, while throughout the room, other grieving families displayed evidence of communications that had bridged the gap between life and death with words of love and forgiveness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sir William began, his cultured voice carrying the weight of governmental authority, "we have convened this commission to investigate reports of supernatural communications received through Canadian Pacific telegraph equipment. Our purpose is not to validate or invalidate these claims, but to establish protocols that protect both the integrity of our communications infrastructure and the welfare of Canadian citizens who may be affected by such phenomena." Clara took her place at the witness table with the steady composure of someone who had learned to navigate between worlds that most people could not imagine. Beside her sat Deputy Marshal Hendricks, whose investigation had evolved from criminal prosecution to scientific documentation of events that challenged every assumption about the nature of human consciousness. Father McKenna occupied the chair to her left, his theological training pressed into service as interpreter of mysteries that transcended conventional religious understanding. "Miss Whitmore," Sir William consulted a thick file of testimony and evidence. "You have claimed that deceased military personnel are communicating through telegraph equipment under your operation. Please explain to this commission how such communication is technically possible." Clara had spent weeks preparing for this moment, consulting every scientific text available while struggling to understand forces that seemed to operate beyond the boundaries of physics. "Sir William, I believe that human consciousness persists after physical death in forms that remain largely unknown to current scientific understanding. Under certain atmospheric conditions, particularly during periods of intense electromagnetic activity, this persistent consciousness can influence telegraph equipment to transmit messages across the boundary between life and death." The commissioners exchanged glances that reflected their struggle to reconcile supernatural claims with rational governance. Sir William made careful notes while his colleagues whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from skeptical doubt to cautious fascination. Clara realized that these men were facing the same moral complexity that had tormented her for months, forced to choose between comfortable denial and uncomfortable truth. "Miss Whitmore, what evidence can you provide to substantiate these remarkable claims?" Before Clara could respond, The schoolhouse door opened to admit Morrison, his uniform bearing new insignia that marked his recent promotion to regional superintendent. The past 3 weeks had transformed him from bitter tyrant to reluctant convert, his father's messages from beyond death forcing him to confront the grief and guilt that had poisoned his judgment for years. He carried a leather portfolio filled with documentation that would prove crucial to the Commission's understanding. "Sir William," Morrison began, his voice carrying the humble tone of someone who had learned hard lessons about the limits of rational control. "I have prepared comprehensive technical reports documenting the electromagnetic conditions present during supernatural transmissions. The evidence suggests that these communications occur during specific atmospheric phenomena that create temporary channels between our world and whatever realm the deceased inhabit." Morrison's testimony carried special weight because of his initial opposition to Clara's claims, his conversion from skeptic to believer, providing powerful evidence that the supernatural communications represented genuine phenomena rather than elaborate fraud. The commissioners listened with growing attention as he detailed his observations of equipment behavior during supernatural transmissions, noting electromagnetic signatures that differed significantly from normal telegraph operations. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "we have established communication protocols that allow controlled interaction with deceased personnel. Families can submit questions through official channels, and responses are transmitted during designated time periods under strict supervision. This system provides comfort to the grieving while maintaining administrative oversight of supernatural communications." Sir William leaned forward with the intense focus of someone recognizing the implications of revolutionary change. "Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that the Canadian government should officially recognize the possibility of communication with deceased persons?" "Sir William, I am suggesting that we have a moral obligation to acknowledge truths that provide comfort to Canadian families who have sacrificed their sons and husbands in service to this nation. Whether we understand these communications or not, they represent a resource that can ease the suffering of those who have borne the greatest costs of our recent conflicts." The afternoon session brought testimony from families who had received messages from deceased relatives, their words carrying the weight of transformed grief and renewed hope. Mrs. Chen described how communications from her son had provided closure regarding questions that had tormented her for years, while Mrs. O'Brien spoke of finding peace through messages that revealed her son's final thoughts and continued love. Father McKenna testified about the theological implications of supernatural communication, arguing that divine mystery often manifested through phenomena that challenged human understanding without undermining faith. As evening approached and the commission prepared to deliberate, Clara found herself standing on the schoolhouse steps watching the sun set over the endless prairie. The landscape that had once seemed harsh and unforgiving now appeared transformed by the knowledge that love could transcend even death itself, that the bonds between human souls might prove stronger than the forces that sought to separate them. Deputy Marshal Hendricks joined her on the steps, his weathered features reflecting the complex emotions of someone who had witnessed the impossible and lived to document its implications. "Miss Whitmore, do you believe the Commission will authorize continued supernatural communications?" Clara considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would reflect not just her own hopes, but her assessment of human nature when confronted with truths too large for easy comprehension. "I believe they will authorize limited protocols that acknowledge the reality of such communications while maintaining governmental control over their implementation. They cannot deny what they have witnessed, but they also cannot allow unlimited access to forces they do not understand." Her prediction proved accurate. The Commission's final report, issued 6 months later, established the Department of Supernatural Communications as a specialized branch of the Federal Telegraph Service. Clara found herself appointed as senior operator for afterlife correspondence, a position that required her to train new personnel in techniques for facilitating communication between the living and the dead. The work demanded not just technical skill, but emotional strength sufficient to bear witness to the deepest griefs and greatest hopes of families seeking connection with their lost loved ones. The protocols that emerged from the Commission's deliberations reflected a careful balance between scientific skepticism and human compassion. Supernatural communications were limited to designated time periods and specific equipment, with all messages subject to official transcription and verification. Families could request communication with deceased relatives through proper administrative channels, but responses could not be guaranteed, and all sessions required supervision by trained personnel. Morrison's promotion to regional superintendent proved that institutional change could accommodate even the most reluctant converts to supernatural reality. His administration of the new protocols reflected hard-won wisdom about the balance between skeptical oversight and respectful acknowledgement of forces beyond human understanding. The bitter tyrant had been transformed into a careful guardian of mysteries that demanded both protection and recognition. The boarding house where Clara continued to live became an informal center for families seeking guidance about supernatural communications. Her reputation as the first person to establish regular contact with the dead attracted visitors from across the prairie provinces, people whose grief had driven them to seek connection with deceased loved ones. She found herself serving not just as telegraph operator, but as counselor and interpreter, helping families understand the implications of messages that bridged the gap between life and death. On quiet evenings, when the station closed and the prairie wind carried the sound of distant trains across the endless landscape, Clara would sometimes receive personal messages that reminded her of the profound responsibility she had accepted. Her own father, who had died when she was 12, occasionally sent communications that provided guidance about her unusual career and reassurance that her choices had been recognized and approved by those who watched from beyond the veil. The weak hand that had once marked her as unsuitable for most employment had become the instrument through which the dead spoke to the living, its trembling now recognized as sensitivity to electromagnetic forces rather than simple physical infirmity. Clara's disability had been transformed into a gift that allowed her to serve as bridge between worlds that most people could not imagine, her limitation becoming the foundation for a calling that few others could fulfill. Years later, when historians wrote about the establishment of supernatural communications in Canada, they would identify Clara's moral courage as the catalyst that transformed official denial into institutional recognition. Her refusal to silence the voices of the dead had created new possibilities for human understanding, expanding the boundaries of what government and society could acknowledge as real and important. But on the spring morning when the commission issued its final report, Clara stood at her telegraph station listening to the familiar chatter of voices from beyond death, their words carrying messages of love and forgiveness that would help heal a nation still scarred by war and loss. The dead had found their voice through her willingness to hear them, and the living world would never be quite the same again. The protocol she had helped establish would endure for generations, a testament to the possibility that human consciousness could transcend even death itself, that love could bridge any gap, and that truth spoken with sufficient courage could transform even the most resistant institutions. In the end, the telegraph operator's secret had become humanity's gift to itself. The knowledge that no separation need be permanent, no loss beyond the reach of hope.